Hey, welcome back to another episode of Detection at Scale. Today, I'm here with two amazing guests, Josh Liburdi, who we've talked to before. Hi, Josh. And Dan Cao. How you guys doing?
Pretty good, Jack.
Good.
It's Friday.
Who goes first?
The 100X engineer should go first, right?
It's a hot day in California. That's all I can say.
It's been very hot everywhere in the US, especially California. I don't think the state's on fire that much right now, right? There's just like a few.
Just a few is not great, but yes.
I mean, it's better than, what do we have? I think during the pandemic, there was like 3 at once, and it was like unlivable in the Bay Area. It was crazy. I don't know if you remember that, but that's when we had masks. We actually all bought masks if you lived in the Bay Area in like 2018, and then they kind of came in handy a few years later during COVID. So that was fun times. But anyways, excited to have you guys on the show. A lot of interesting things we're going to talk about in security. I got the idea to have you both on the show just after seeing a lot of kind of back and forth banter, and thought we could have a fun conversation about security engineering and stuff like that. So why don't we start with quick intros? Dan, you can go first. You're new to the podcast. So
I'm Dan. I have a background in security engineering, and I've led teams at Gusto, and I'm an ex-Meta guy, and I'll be starting something relatively interesting soon in the next couple of days here.
Josh Liburdi, happy to be back. Can't believe you brought me back, but happy to be here with Dan. I'm a staff security engineer at Brex. I've been there almost 4 years now, which is a very long time for me. And can we just take this moment to say Dan and I used to work together at one point?
I didn't know that
relevant.
actually. Where did you guys work together?
So let me tell my side of it, Dan, then maybe you can go, which is that we worked together at Target. I worked remotely, and I didn't come into the office very much. This is all before COVID, when working from home wasn't really a thing. And Dan and I never talked when I worked at Target, which I think is really funny. Like, we did not really become friends until later.
No, that's pretty accurate. Like, Josh would come in, I think maybe like once a quarter, something like that. He was always the hipster guy with the clear glasses. And I was like, who's this guy? You know, he's on the detection team. And we maybe like talked once or twice while we were at Target. But it wasn't until after Target that we really like connected, I guess, and started talking more security. I think you landed at Splunk after, right? And then I think I was at Coupang or something like that. So yeah, it was a ton of fun. Just talking to each other. Like, I guess we both kind of broke into quote unquote tech. And
Oh, come on.
That's
rude.
kind of interesting.
Target is a great tech company.
Target is a great tech company, but I'm talking about like the sectors, right? Like Target, you consider a retail sector. The rest of the companies we've worked for are kind of like tech sector. You don't see Target, or like you don't see any of our companies in like FSI sacks or something. Well, maybe Brex. I don't know.
Wait, so what were your roles at Target?
I don't know what the team is called now. It was a threat intel detection engineering team at the time. And I was kind of hired to do like special project kind of work. That's when I worked on Strelka at Target. That's where that all comes from. And then, yeah, Dan, you can tell your side of it.
Yeah, I was on CSER there. So I did a lot of like hands-on defer work there. And I broke a lot of our tools because I just write queries that our tools did not like.
Wait, Josh, what was the project you said? That was the prerequisite for something, right? Or I remember you mentioned that on the last episode.
I developed Strelka. It's a file scanning system. It's used, I don't know, I wouldn't say widely in the industry today. I think there are fans of it. It is used in some security products today. But yeah, the team was great. We built a lot of stuff that you just don't see other teams doing because it was just a whole different scale compared to most of, I would say, not just retail, but tech. But maybe I have rose-tinted glasses from that aspect. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, wasn't Strelka like a branch off of Leica because you wanted Python 3 support or something?
I can give you the 30-second history, which is that we were going to deploy Leica Boss, which was built at Lockheed Martin, which was built on Python 2. And then I was going to just upgrade it to Python 3. And it was such a pain in the butt to do that upgrade because it was so complex. I just started rewriting it from scratch in Python 3. So the first iteration of that internally was actually mostly just a port. But then as I was working on it, I was like, okay, let's actually change how this works and add in these new features. And then it became a different project. But yeah, There's a lineage there. It's, it's like literally in the name of the project. So
What were you predominantly using it or like what types of files? Was it endpoint? Was it server? Was it kind of all the above?
I probably shouldn't say. It's
Let me
not like
rephrase.
super secret, but yeah.
In the wild, like in the community, what was like the common practice?
I think the obvious solution is email. That's the most obvious solution. There's a lot of bad stuff in email, and you want to know what's inside those files. Like if it's like nested files in an archive, what's in a PDF that's being delivered, like what URLs are in a PDF, for example. I think it's still like kind of a gap in the email protection space. Like really, I would call it like, you have the concept of deep packet inspection in network appliances. There's like some phrases on the internet that say like deep file inspection. It's kind of like that. There really aren't very many vendors kind of like operating in that space. There's some like point solutions, like email security solutions that use systems like Strelka or use it directly. But there's no one that's like really offering a product that's like, hey, let's just do deep file inspection everywhere. Because like your enterprise network, like your business is just a combination of files, network connections, and processes. That's what everything is. So it doesn't matter if it's in the cloud or on your laptop or on your mobile phone.
I was expecting you to say people somewhere in there too.
There's people too.
Not for long. Not the AI is going to take over. Dan, so you said something on LinkedIn I thought was pretty funny, and you're probably so scared by me starting my sentence in that way. But you said there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all security strategy, program, or technology. Let's talk about that for a second. Can you drop some elaboration into that and let's just understand what you meant by that?
I think it's pretty obvious. Like, as security engineering leaders, or like if you're leading any sort of security engineering team, you have a lot of vendors that come to you and say, this will solve all your problems, right? Truth of the matter, that's not it. And my point around not having a one size fits all solution is, what works for me at my company might not work for Josh at his company, right? We have different size teams, we have different size budgets, we have different intellectual property that we need to protect. So why does it make sense to have one size fits all? It's just not possible. And it's some of the banter that Josh and I go back and forth on LinkedIn about with like MITRE ATT&CK, right? He trolls and like he crosses out a bunch of like tactics. And it's kind of true. It kind of piggybacks off of that, right? What he wants to detect there might not be what an individual in, I don't know, some big tech company might want to detect. So that's kind of my point is think about, your individual organization. Think about, the defense in depth that you have or that you can potentially have and try and fill those gaps as best as you can.
You said something else about you'll need to build a program based on your team's skill sets. So is the point there that the tools and techniques and all the other things should be tailored to the level of experience from the folks around you? Or
I am a firm believer in teaching fundamentals and understanding fundamentals more than tools. I can teach people tools day in and day out, right? It's much harder to teach the fundamentals of like technology. So if you have a team with skill sets that may not necessarily fit to one particular tool, like it's a lot easier to teach them, the mindset of here are the things that we should look for. Like what's the analytical mindset, right? So shout out to like Chris Sanders and the analyst mindset training. Like that's a big part of it. And I think one of the things that we forget about as leaders oftentimes is we're probably inheriting a team most of the time, right? So when you're coming in and you're inheriting a team, you might not necessarily have like people that fulfill the gaps that you identify as you come into the team. But there's context there, there's history there, there's a reason why those individuals were hired. So as you build out your team, you should really think about where are the strengths of my team, allow those folks to continue building and leaning into their strengths, and then identifying some of those gaps and, filling to hire those gaps. And that's really like my mindset around how we should hire, how we should build teams is like, what skill sets do you have and how can I improve those skill sets, and then allow the individuals on the team to really work with one another and cross-train each other.
Do you guys see a pattern in the industry where people are getting more developer oriented, or is that a bubble in Silicon Valley?
More developer oriented. What's an example?
Like more emphasis on writing code to solve your problem versus, relying on a vendor or AI to solve your problem type of a thing.
Oh yeah.
Right. It's like, and if you think about also the economy and in tooling and security, there's a lot of dev driven things. I think like even Substation's a good example of that. Like you literally designed a tool to solve a big problem of like security ETL. But if you think about how other SIMs do it, it's like, it's just kind of transparent. You shove it in. It doesn't really work at scale, things like that. So I'm just trying to think about, do we think the world is going in a direction where more people are going to get, Pythonic and Go developers and security, or is it still going to remain this like split where you have like a small percentage of the overall market, like who's actually doing that work?
I think that it's the opposite. I think that my prediction is if you look at the trends of the market, that you will probably see less build-centric, I'm just going to call it build-centric kind of security teams as these smaller security solutions kind of crop up. Because people build things when they don't have a solution, right? Like I, in a lot of ways wish I hadn't spent time building Substation, because if something had existed at the time that did what I wanted, I wouldn't have had spent my time on it. And I would just pay someone like a reasonable amount of money to never think about this problem. So I think there's 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the security startup space was a lot smaller. I think it's shifting more toward a model where you have really big platforms like Palo Alto, CrowdStrike, etc. Those kinds of size companies, they're the platform layer, like platformization is a term. Then you have all these smaller players who are like building like really bespoke solutions to problems that they probably won't make it to the end of the marathon. They'll probably get swallowed by the big fish. So as long as those smaller solutions keep popping up, I don't really see a need to keep building bespoke tools. But the caveat to that is like, are you building something that is just solving a problem that is just not solved? And that's kind of where I've spent my time. And that's sort of what I try to tell like the team that I work on and other teams I talk to is like, don't spend your time building things that already exist. Like spend your time making things that exist better, or put your effort into solving problems that have no good solution right now. I think that is like a different thing than saying like, will teams work in Python? Will teams work in a code repo like Git? Like they will do that. But I think if you look at just like the market trends, that there's a lot of security startups out there. And I think there's probably a preference to just try one of those out first before you build your own thing.
So do you ultimately think that the big three platforms will just kind of swallow everything up? You made a comment about it, so I'd love to understand like the thinking.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think the easy answer is yes, but then you see like a company like Wiz, which I think Wiz is like the company to pay attention to, because they came out strong with what seems like a good product, but then they just kept growing, and they kept growing in a way where they are in a very short amount of time like one of those platform companies now. If you look at the acquisitions they've been making, the way their product has changed. So I do think that those big platform companies will continue to exist. They'll acquire companies. I don't think it's impossible to break into that space if you're in like a novel part of the market, right? Like cloud was pretty novel even a few years ago. And now you're looking at like segments of that, like runtime in cloud is like an exploding part of the market. So they'll continue to exist and they'll die off too. I mean, if you think about like what happened to FireEye, FireEye was a massive company at one point, and I don't know what they're up to now, if they even still exist.
They're still around. I think they.
Oh God.
I think they were purchased though. But yeah, I mean, to Josh's point, like there's certainly like a convergence that we're seeing where a lot of these big players are buying these smaller companies. But I think, going back to your question, Jack, of like, are we seeing more like developer-centric security operations or security incident response. Like, I think we kind of are in a little bit of a bubble. You know, I firmly believe the tech industry is very unique in that sense. They're a little more agile, right? Because we tend to have smaller teams. And when you have smaller teams, you have to solve those problems for all of your bespoke technologies, because you can't just plop in some commercial off the shelf solution to fix your problems. I think you can probably solve 70 to 80% of it with something commercial off the shelf. But there are a lot of companies that run very, very custom tech stacks, right? And at least in my eyes, like very large teams, if you look at maybe like the top Fortune 10 companies, those are all large companies. As your team or as your company grows larger and larger, and your mandates around like compliance and regulation grows, you're going to need more people. And when you have more people, you can't just have them working on all the same things, because now you have too many cooks in the kitchen. So then there's just this natural progression of, hey, we're going to split off, detection engineers from security incident responders, from security engineers, or from like IAM engineers, right? It naturally just kind of progresses that way, because there are things around reliability that you have to account for. There are things around just subject matter expertise and burnout. Like, everybody can't know everything. So in a sense, I kind of agree with Josh. I think there's certainly a bubble that we're in the tech industry.
I wanted to pick on the platform a little bit more too. Do you guys think that people actually buy all of the suites of the tools in a platform, or do you think it's always going to be like a sprinkle of like, okay, I'm going to use this over here, this over here? Because I mean, the promise of a platform is to have, the main product and then sort of distribute other products alongside it. But I guess I'm curious in reality how this ends up playing, because it can cause a lot of problems if like one platform is trying to control everything, like the data layer. So how do you guys think about the balance of like using the big platforms in certain cases and then sprinkling other tools in a way that like builds the program cohesively?
I'm trying to think of the tools that we use without saying them, but we definitely don't use every feature of every platform we have. But I think it's like a Trojan horse kind of thing, right? It's like, one, these companies never start as like a platform, almost always. Like, they start as a really great product that just builds the platform around it. And then so as maybe a buyer or someone evaluating a new set of tools, you're like, okay, why don't we just look at the vendor we already have and are happy with? Presumably you're happy with the platform, right? If you're not happy with the platform, you have a whole separate set of problems. But I think that's part of it. It just really makes it easier to bring in new tech. And the advantage of sticking to the platform is that it is all integrated, right? Things get weird though when these companies do poor integration. So if they just acquire a bunch of companies and then the integrations don't make sense, don't provide value, like that's where things can go very wrong. I would never personally say like, we have this platform, so you need to only use the products from the platform, unless that was like in the contract or whatever. Like, if we have a deal or we get all the access to everything, like, yeah, why would you not use it? But I think like ideally you're selecting the best tool for the job. These platforms also don't always last forever, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about some of the big news around like CrowdStrike in particular, right? CrowdStrike recently announced that they're allowing 10 gigs of ingest from your IDP independently into their platform. And CrowdStrike's already huge as an EDR, right? So this concept around platformization makes a lot of sense. You can have all of your logs in one place backed by Humio or LogScale, or I don't think they're backed by Splunk anymore. I think it's LogScale now. But it makes sense, right? You have this EDR agent that's going to run on all your corp endpoints. You potentially have a cloud agent that can run in your cloud if you allow kernel-based agents. And then, they have this platform that also has things like vuln management, and then they're breaking into the DLP space. So platformization makes a lot of sense for some of the smaller security teams that don't want to manage a lot of these tools. And they want to just go to one platform to rule them all. Realistically, like when you get to a size that's like so large, to Josh's point, like hopefully you're just picking the right tool for the job versus choosing the platform because it's there and it's convenient and you already have a contract and an NDA signed with them. But it makes sense for a lot of like SMBs to choose one platform and to stick to it. It simplifies things for them. And oftentimes, like these big vendors, they focus on enterprise. There's a lot of focus on enterprise, but there are a ton of like small, medium businesses out there that need security that don't have the budget for like even a full-time security engineer. So yeah, you bring in someone that has an entire platform that can hopefully do it all for you, and it's better than nothing, essentially.
What do you think is a tipping point from buying a solution that is just kind of generalized to, going back to this point of like building your security program out, right? Because I think we have like check the box solutions, and then we have like, let's actually make this effective. So do you think it's like a company maturity thing or a team, like security team maturity thing? Like when does that tend to happen in your experience?
It's like a cost analysis most of the time of, hey, if I'm building a bespoke tool, how likely am I going to have to support this in the long run? And how much is it going to cost me in engineering hours, opposed to I can go spend $400K on this contract for 3 years. There's no way I can build a tool that matches the capabilities of this vendor over the next 3 years at this price. Like ideally, that's what we should be talking about as we think about vendors, as we think about build versus buy. But, kind of like I mentioned earlier, there are teams that are just running very bespoke tooling where it would cost more to try and integrate a tool than it would to just build a tool because you have a dedicated team of people to build said tool for you.
So here's what I think. You have a new team, or maybe you have no security team, or you have a security team that's been around for a little bit. You're not going to build everything from scratch in that team, right? You're going to bring in your platforms to get the coverage you need to protect the company. And you'll probably spend whatever you need to do that. You probably have a pretty good budget to do that, at least in the areas that matter. So, and that's just making your small team scale, like across like the scope of security operations, which is vast. So there's like your small team. But then there becomes a point, which is what Dan is talking about, where the team gets bigger, it becomes more mature, they have more resourcing to invest in different areas. And so you might build bespoke solutions to unique problems. I think the like ideal endpoint with that is you just continue to rely on the software that is reliable and good enough and build on top of that while innovating where you need to, but not going so far as to innovate everywhere. Like on a big mature team, not every solution has to be built in-house. And I would actually say, to like the point Dan made, like that is scary, I think, because like then you have usually a couple people on the team that know how this works really well. You have attrition risk when those people leave the company, or if they get moved to a different project. There's a lot of risk there. So as long as I think like where I would recommend like a mature team go is like constantly iterate on the innovation, but know when to step back and be like, hey, like this vendor, they're building the same thing we have. Why don't we just use them instead? Because then we can go focus on other areas. That's probably what I would recommend instead of, God save any team that's reinventing every wheel that exists.
Oh, come on, Josh. You don't want to build your own SIM? You don't want to turn a substation into an XDR?
Well, I didn't say that, but
I'm just kidding.
It's not a choice I might not choose to build my own SIM today. Haven't seen it done a couple times.
I don't recommend it.
You would know.
I poke fun, but that's one of those things where it's like there's so many solutions out there. There has to be some compelling reason to roll a tool like that or to build a tool like that.
Honestly, like the reasons are honestly really, really simple. It's either you have no budget or the solution just doesn't meet your needs, right? So you build something that doesn't exist, or you just can't get the funding for the thing that you want. And so you build something that is like probably 60% good enough and it looks nicer on the balance sheet to your CFO. That's kind of like what it ends up being, like usually one of those two things.
Seen that pattern a few times. But it's like the lack of budget's kind of an illusion, right? Because you're spending hours, it's not free, but, it might be less than a $500,000 contract or something for sure. What new tech are you guys paying attention to when it comes to security monitoring? Like what's been like the new hotness that has been interesting either in endpoint, network, cloud, kind of just across the board? What's exciting right now? And you can't say substation.
eBPF, probably. I honestly can't say that I've seen anything that is very exciting to me. So I'm curious what Dan's seen.
Oh man, runtime security monitoring and cloud workloads. Like that is, you touched on it earlier, right? All the eBPF agents. I think that is a really exciting space just because your traditional eBPF agents, Falco, Sysdig, they've been around for a long time. You see performance impacts with them. There's a lot of compatibility issues with them. And then now all of a sudden you've got big vendors offering runtime security and monitoring. You have Wiz, you've got AWS that's now offering runtime security monitoring and integrated with GuardDuty. Everything costs money, of course, but I think people are finally coming around to like, it's not enough to just know what's going on in the cloud and not know what's going on like at the workload or on bare metal. That's something that's really interesting. And even like supply chain monitoring or like supply chain stuff, I think we still, like the industry still doesn't have a great answer for that. That's going to be a pretty big challenge.
I was going to make a comment to say, like, is any of that what you just said about runtime agents actually exciting? Because I don't think it is. But then you made me think of, I'm not going to pitch a vendor here, but like Socket. I think like Socket is actually a very interesting solution. And I can't speak to any experience with it, but I like the way they seem to be building that product as a non-user. Like I think about like some of this stuff, like fully knowing I have no answers to this question, which is like, what are people building that are actually going to solve problems that stop breaches or make systems more secure? And like what I see a lot of is just like a lot of the same things being built by new vendors that aren't really changing much. So I think that hurts my like excitement for what's happening in the security industry right now.
When it comes to the runtime stuff though, like what's the innovation? Is it just more verbosity in like what you're seeing? I mean, why is that an exciting and like impactful thing for those who may not be familiar with eBPF and how that works?
For me, it's because a lot of runtime security monitoring agents out there are prepackaged detections that do most organizations no good. So when you finally have your capabilities catch up to the rest of like traditional detection engineering or even like NSM, whatever it is, it's a big deal, right? Not relying on a black box detection and being able to roll your own, being able to tune your own in line effectively is very exciting to me, especially as I refer back to Josh's reinventing the ETL pipeline for security talk. Like if you can do it in the pipeline, you're going to reduce costs, you're going to be more effective, and you're going to be able to like build context much quicker. So yeah, I think that's why like runtime security monitoring and like eBPF agents are so exciting to me, just because you can get all that visibility at very low performance cost. And not a lot of vendors are doing a really good job at it.
Yeah, I guess like things that should just exist can be exciting to the point you made earlier. Like this should have just existed for a long time and no one was building it because they were focused on the control plane of the cloud, right? They weren't focused on the workloads. To me, it's just a lot of like repeating the pattern of building the thing we had 10 years ago in a new environment. And innovation is short. It's hard to come by in this industry, I think. I mean, I don't think everyone needs to be an innovator to be successful, but it's tough to see all these companies come out and just build the same thing over and over.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want to see more like IDP-based vendors, detections across that vendor space, more of like a unified model with everybody kind of migrating to cloud. Like, how hard can it be? Or I should say, it can be very difficult to do an investigation on like an AWS resource if you don't have the proper logging in place, if you don't have the proper like visibility across your IDPs, if you're using like SSO and stuff, like it's really hard to do an investigation like that. And for me, like investigation should be relatively easy. Like present as much data as you can to the engineer or the analyst, the investigator, and allow them to make a determination like, is this thing bad or not? So yeah. And of course, like focusing on the IDP, focusing on the identity is like where we should go now, just because that's where technology has kind of moved to.
So more of an emphasis on connecting the dots and understanding the people. And I know, Josh, we talked about enrichment and doing it in the pipeline last time, but seems like that's sort of bubbles more towards like business risk as well. Because now you can say, okay, this identity has this meaning and they have this access. So packaging that up in an efficient way.
It's just about saving people time, which is what Dan is saying too. It's like, just give me the stuff I need to do my job and make it easy. It's so simple. Like, why can't the vendors do that?
We're trying, Josh. We're trying. You know, the thing that's funny is like, look, like I was in your guys' shoes, 6 years ago. And when you sort of change roles, you lose like the first person perspective of the job, right? Like, cause my experience is until, 2018, right? And I got to see a lot being at Yahoo and Airbnb and like those companies. But I think the innovation kind of happens like in those periods where you get that inspiration. So it's actually a big reason why I think this podcast is so important. So we can hear from folks like yourselves who are like in the seat doing it every day. The interesting thing, from a vendor's perspective is the market actually often pushes the vendors, and I've felt this firsthand, to existing solutions. So it's like we sort of went to market as like, okay, we're trying to do, real-time Python analysis with detection as code, which is just completely different from what people were doing in like an Elastic, for example. And that was kind of the status quo with SIM. You just kind of shove all the logs in, use a DSL, and you're good to go. But not in reality, right? It's like it didn't really work. That's why you built Substation. That's why I built Streamalert. It's like it was always around necessity. So the really interesting thing is a lot of feedback. People basically, like if you piece it all together, it's Splunk. It's like everything that people ask for is literally Splunk. And I'm like, well, how could you expect the vendor to innovate if the market wants you to stay at the status quo? So it's like a really interesting innovator's dilemma, right? Like where you have to be kind of like seeing the market from a different perspective and saying, no. I think that they're not seeing it in the right way, and there's actually better ways to do it. Let me show you that. So that's kind of been the challenge. So that's probably why you see, you mentioned eBPF is because eBPF is not new, by the way. I heard about eBPF like 10 years ago when I was working as a security engineer. People were like, oh yeah, we're testing this out. But it's kind of the same thing with SIMs. It's kind of the same repeated thing over and over again. And Humio is actually kind of a good example of that. It's like a similar type of interface, but different tech under the surface, right? It's like a little bit more scalable. It's blob storage versus like an index store or something. But yeah, those trends are really interesting. I tend to see that like it's powered by like the market sort of like pulling you back down to like what status quo is.
I think like my opinion on it as someone who is not a vendor is it must be easier to break into an emerging market that doesn't have someone who's been there for decades, who people love to use, but maybe hate to pay for, which is exactly what you just described. So I'm sure no founder would be excited by the idea of, hey, let's just build a cheaper Splunk. Like that sounds terrible. Like I would not want to do that. But versus like, let's break into cloud monitoring or let's break into runtime monitoring. I think that's why you see like this race to runtime monitoring. Like there's so many vendors in that space. Like they're all kind of, even though eBPF is not new, like they're all fighting over this new market space. So I talk to a lot of people all the time about some of the stuff that I work on, and like I have conversations with them and I'm like, you just don't get this. And that's okay. Like I think it's totally fine that you build something that is not for everyone. As a vendor, that's obviously not like in your best interest because you want to sell your product. But like as a developer who's just working on a project that's free and open source, I don't care if no one uses it as long as we get value out of it. So
at the same time, like timing is really important too, right? There are so many You just think about some of the companies that were way ahead of their time with some of the products that they released, like Google Glass is like a great example of ahead of its time. People didn't really want it. And now you've got like Meta Ray-Bans. And I kind of feel that way right now with Sims to an extent, right? Everybody's kind of talking about the data lake model and detection as code. It's like, it's not necessarily really new, but a lot of companies still really want to use Splunk because it's straightforward, it's easy, you can do so many things with it, and you can teach people how to use it fairly quickly, right? There's less of a barrier to entry using something like Splunk. But at the same time, I love, what the data lake model and like what Panther is trying to do. And like one of the things that I think is really important, again, going back to Josh's talk, is like being able to do things inline and being able to like do ETL inline so you can just have all of your data available there in the alert for your investigator, because then it just becomes less complex and nobody really wants to manage like super complex systems.
I mean, yeah, we do things like in a very different way compared to a lot of how a lot of companies or how a lot of security teams run their data visibility and SIM systems. But I did want to say one thing about what you said about Splunk, which is that it's easier to use. It's only easier to use because it's been around for so long and it's so ubiquitous. Like if people had started just using Python, whatever, 15 years ago, like it'd be easy to use because everyone would just know how to use it for this. Like it's the time in the market, and they did a heck of a job selling that product forever. So like, I think you're going to see that as new companies emerge. Like I mentioned Wiz earlier, I think Wiz is possibly capable of doing that, where like everyone's just like saying like, why would we ever leave Wiz? Or we just want you to build Wiz again. There's only like a theoretical barrier to entry SQL or SQL, right? It's just because you just don't have any experience and you don't want to invest the time into learning it. I don't mean that to like disparage anyone who struggles with it or doesn't have the time to learn it, but it's just like the tools in this industry very often define the capabilities of the team, right? Like you will be for better or worse, you will be limited potentially for years based on the tools that are available to you, which is like, I think, maybe a bit different than how a traditional like software company is run, where you just like imagine it and build it. Like it doesn't really happen a lot in security teams.
Way back to the beginning when I kind of talked about like building teams, it's like that's why you like teach people fundamentals, right? And you don't teach people tool specific things. Like that's exactly what it is, Josh. If we had started with Python long ago and we just said, yeah, we're going to continue like the big data thing, the EDWs back then, right? And we're going to continue down the path of SQL because it's so flexible, it's so powerful, but it takes a little while to learn. If we had just continued down that path, like, where would we be now? I don't know. Further ahead? Maybe.
Yeah, it's like this like spaceship meme where it's like the world is perfect if everyone just knew Python.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I was actually thinking about this completely unrelated to this current conversation, but I was thinking recently that like the most important skill set in this kind of work is your thinking skills, especially critical thinking and abstract thinking. And I think there's a lot of emphasis put on critical thinking, which is like your ability to focus and draw like conclusions based on evidence. Like that's all very important. But also this thing we're talking about right now is like more like abstract. It's like, I know how Splunk works. So now I can use anything that looks like Splunk. I don't need to know just Splunk. I can do anything that looks like it. Or I know SPL, which is the Splunk language, but I can understand how that translates to SQL or SQL. So I think like the ability to make those like abstract connections and do the fundamentals, which is what Dan has said multiple times, is really important. And I mean, it's like the best career advice I could probably give to anyone is like focus on your thinking skills and don't bet your whole career on being good at one tool or a suite of tools.
How do you think about deepening your thinking skills? Is it books? Is it just analysis? I mean, what would you recommend people who are listening?
I think it's the team. And I say that as someone who doesn't really learn technical concepts from books very well. Like I could never read a technical book and be happy. So I think it's like the team. Like I think you really want to select a good team if you're interviewing and be like, hey, can I learn from anyone like how to do these things? Which I think is, again, goes back to Dan's point of like, optimizing for skill sets, investing time to learn, which is a struggle on a small team where it's like we have a lot to do, but do I have time to actually learn? Sometimes I think about this as a more senior person on a team. I'm like, I say things to people, but do they really know why I'm saying what I'm saying? Because sometimes I don't hear the question back like, how did you come to that conclusion? Or how did you like arrive at this solution? Like when I don't hear that, I'm like concerned because sometimes like it's not an obvious solution or an obvious conclusion. So I worry for people that aren't asking enough questions.
Dan, what do you think?
I guess I've said it quite a lot, right? Like fundamentals is more important than anything else, right?
Mm.
If you understand underlying technologies, you can abstract away the tool specific thing to learn something new. And that's really important for people trying to break into the industry, right? Like so often I read things like, I'm getting this certain, this certain, this certain. Honestly, like, cool. A certification will give you a little bit of hands-on training. It'll give you a lot of textbook training, but the best training is on the job training and like feet to the fire. You drink from the fire hose, right? And you're never going to learn anything the first time through it. Like you just won't. And it'll take 2 or 3 times. But that's why it's important to, to Josh's point, like pick a team that has these mentorship capabilities, that has a culture of like pairing, that's open to helping one another, and not teams that are very like siloed to an extent. And like not picking on Josh in particular or anything, but like if you go to a very senior team, it can be very difficult to learn as like a new grad. And that is something that like as a manager, as a leader, you have to be very cognizant about when you're hiring and what level you're hiring for. Because if you don't have those paths already laid out for you, it's going to be really difficult for people to onboard.
Yeah, I felt that in my career. Like when I was an IC, I tried to join a really senior team and it just like would never going to work, because my basis of knowledge was just so much lower than theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's intimidating, Cool, guys. Well, I think let's end with one piece of advice or one piece of exciting news that you guys want to share with listeners. It could be like a talk. It could be hiring, anything. Let's go Dan first since this is your first time on the show.
Piece of advice: invest in yourself and invest in learning the fundamentals of technology. And I guess don't feel stuck in what you're doing. Just remember when you're applying for cybersecurity roles or IT roles or whatever it is, it only takes one company to give you a yes out of 1,000 applications. So don't get yourself down.
Good advice. I was going to say just like go for a walk or like read a non-technical book or something like that. Do something that's not work related. Like, and also just like chill out. Like if you're like all stressed out about work, just like take a break. It's not worth it.
I love it. Thanks, guys, for coming on the show. Josh, it was great to have you on again. Dan, thanks for coming on for the first time and really enjoyed the commentary about the market. Learned a lot from listening to you guys, so really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thanks for having us on. It's fun.
Yep. Great to see you again.